with the Ryanair story, it wasn't really on the fronts of any papers today. Lots of analysis on what's described as the climb down by Michael OLeary on unionisation. But I would imagine for many a family around the country, either those that were going to escape and go away, or perhaps more importantly, who were expecting family members home, they will really want to know what is happening. Now, we know that meetings on union recognition are going to take place between IALPA, Impact and Ryanair later this week. What we still don't know, though, is if the strike is going to go ahead. Now, we had a statement from Bernard Harbour of Impact, and he said, we're available, that's Impact, available to meet Ryanair this evening if they could make themselves available. We're happy to meet Ryanair management on Tuesday evening at 5 or any time sooner. Once we have met, we can take a decision on deferring Wednesday's industrial action. We could do this today, but the companies say they're unavailable to meet until Tuesday evening. Now, that once we have met means, I presume, that the travelling public are not going to be informed until after that meeting has taken place, which I would say is pretty rough. Now, we're joined on the phone by Eoghan Corry, who is editor of Travel Extra. Eoghan, what's going on here? Is this cat and mouse or messing or seriousness, or what is it?
All of the above, Marian. The way these things work is there's a choreography to the whole industrial relations process. There's a lot of rules that apply that probably don't make sense when they're brought out of the negotiation room. There tends to be a bit of obstinacy, a bit of showing how much power they have, and probably the only advantage of Ryanair recognising unions is that instead of the chaotic people going on strike with no negotiation process, will now have the machinery at their behest that is provided in the negotiation process, and then all the things that are very well oiled up for when things go wrong with the Labour Court and so on. That is new to Ryanair, and it's also new to IALPA for dealing with Ryanair. So I wouldn't expect things to move very fast. I would expect the threat of the strike action to remain in place because it's a big weapon, and they've waited a long time to bring Ryanair to the negotiating table. And Ryanair obviously would like them to say, "Oh, you've recognised the union, we'll call off the action." But I think that there is a good deal of suspicion around,
right.
And it's things to be trashed out.
On their own website, Ryanair are saying that they will publish contingency plans tomorrow. The only thing is, like, for the travelling public, this is a bit of a disaster. I mean, it's Christmas.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, creating the uncertainty. And that's what the pilots managed to do in their non-unionised role when they first called the strike. I'd imagine Ryanair were very gung-ho. They've seen through these situations before. I think maybe new personnel in the airline who are more used to dealing with unions probably became involved in the decision-making process. And they were, Ryanair are pretty good at faking it. There's lots of aircraft floating around at the moment. Qatar Airways have spare aircraft that were used by British Airways in a strike situation earlier this year, and were used in the rescue of the Monarch customers that some listeners will remember. There's plenty of options for Ryanair to face down the scale of the industrial action. And the other thing is, we don't know how widespread the disruption will be. We don't know how many pilots are involved. The IALPA statements before the shock recognition of the union were based on the fact that they didn't have large numbers of pilots, but they did have captains. And they could cause more disruption than Ryanair imagined.
Right, because you can't fly without a captain.
The plan is still there.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I was reading in the Business Post that pilots of airlines that went bust throughout the year, such as Air Berlin, Alitalia, are now knocking on Ryanair's door looking for work. But we were all under the impression that there was a worldwide shortage of pilots.
It's a slightly complicated process of getting an Airbus pilot to fly a Boeing. There's a training period involved. But one of the things that has happened to Ryanair is that other airlines were picking up Boeing pilots. But you're absolutely right. They've hired, the last figure I think I saw was 860 to the end of October, new pilots hired by Ryanair this year. And that's probably gone past the 900 now. They need that anyway because their growth was around 10%. It has been running at around 10%. Passenger growth numbers for November, the growth was still 6%. It was down from what they've been running. I think they see the growth tapering off, but you've got to remember this is still growth by an airline that is huge, and it's going to be the biggest airline in Europe. For 2017, considering the Lufthansa Group, who are second, have 5 separate brands, 5 separate airlines. That's a huge achievement. The problems that creates is that managing the scale of that is getting more and more complicated with each year. Recruiting pilots is only part of that game. And I think, locking into an industrial relations process is proving really attractive. More attractive for Ryanair than it ever has been in the past, although the chief executive would suggest otherwise.
Why?
To give some sort of shape to industrial relations issues that could spiral out of control otherwise.
Right.
As I say, the process is there. It generally works. It generally works to prevent strikes. Ryanair were not participants in that process until now.
Right. Can I come to you, Michael Doherty, as employment law professor? How do you read what's going on here and how do you see the future?
I think Eoghan has flagged the two key things here. There's the choreography and the theatre around industrial relations, and there's the substance. In terms of the substance, I think the point is why do companies ever recognise unions? Well, there's a couple of answers. One is so that discontent is channelled, and that I think is what Eoghan's getting at. This is really unusual for people like me to see a situation where you have a multinational company with bases across Europe where there's actually coordinated action between pilots, in this case, in different countries. I mean, that's really unusual. Industrial relations normally stops at the national border. So there is clearly an incentive. Nobody believes for a second this line Ryanair are putting out that they knew this day would always come where they would recognise unions.
Are you suggesting for a moment that anybody would mislead us in something like that?
Well, I mean, I've heard that line a lot this week. It's a matter of a year or two, I think, since they actually left Copenhagen because they wouldn't sign a collective agreement. So if this day was coming, it was not a secret revealed to mere mortals like ourselves. So it's a pragmatic decision that, for reasons Eoghan mentioned there about employment practices and so on, but also because there's clearly discontent, and this is one way of managing it. But the problem we have is maybe around the theatre. Ryanair does not do conciliation, negotiation. It doesn't engage in the IR dance that we're all so familiar with of talks and engagement and breakdown and re-engagement and so on. And even on Friday, I think it was, there was a really dismissive comment from a Ryanair spokesperson that the trade union, it was an early morning programme, and he said, the trade unionists probably haven't got out of bed yet.
That's really designed to kind of encourage.
It really is. And well, of course,
create good relations.
What's interesting is the union are quite rightly looking for a very, very early meeting, and it seems Ryanair today and tomorrow are having duvet days or something because they're not actually available to meet. I mean, that's extraordinary that you would have a potential strike of this magnitude on Wednesday, and the company involved says, well, we can meet you Tuesday evening. I mean,
it seems extraordinary. I feel terribly sorry for the travelling public. That's who I feel really sorry for. I mean, damn it, give them some kind of certainty. Either there's a strike or there isn't a strike.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose this is again part of the problem around the theatre and the dance and so on. But I mean, there wasn't much news in the papers today about this, so a lot of the articles are actually kind of
analysis.
Exactly, yeah. and they're reflecting. A lot of them are about spin and narrative. So like Brendan O'Connor has a piece in the Sindo where he's saying, one thing about Michael OLeary is he's cute and I wouldn't write him off yet because, of course, if the strike goes ahead on Wednesday, The company will take a lot of flack, absolutely, but always in these situations, unions get a lot of flack too, and maybe this is part of the rationale.
Right. Can I go back to you, Eoghan? Because you allege, I better be careful what I say here, that the rates of pay and conditions for pilots in Ryanair are pretty terrific, and that they're better than Aer Lingus. So why all the dissatisfaction?
It's about largely about power. Ryanair since September have this again a shortage, not so much of pilots as captains of rank, that caused them to ground flights. This is there have been 4 previous attempts to unionise Ryanair's workforce, and immediately when he was in that self-inflicted rostering problem, he found himself there. It was quite clear that this would be a green light for pilots within Ryanair who wanted to get recognition for their union membership, because there were always some pilots who had union membership. This would be their opportunity. The pay rates and the terms and conditions under which pilots fly for Ryanair, the company always says they've been quite generous in them. The reason being that pilots are they're the most powerful body within the workforce, and you really, if you want to keep a scheduled service flying on time all the time, which is the Ryanair's business model is central to it, is that everything arrives to parts on time. We all remember those terrible trumpets that we had to listen to when trains landed. But if the pilots are on your side, you can do that. If they're not, things start going wrong very quickly. The pay would be 150,000 to 180,000 a year, and there was always a suggestion that there would be a sort of a premium. It was never really said. There was a sort of a premium for the fact that you weren't in a union, that you got paid a little more, and he'd always say that he was paying the best rates. But then, when something happens like another airline, as Norwegian did, by 100 Boeings, it's very hard to manage that. And we had the suggestion in September that Ryanair pilots were leaving the company. So, the spin, as Michael was saying, there's been a little bit of a battle for who controls the narrative on this pilots issue since September. But it's quite clear that previous efforts to unionise Ryanair, the first we saw on a pan-European basis was back in 2013. The game plan was wheeled out again, and they managed to coordinate a series of actions, and it was quite an amazing, quite an amazing victory for the pilots. The pilots have been startled themselves that they won that recognition on Friday. And I agree with you; it's always bad for passengers. Passengers will be now disrupted by strike threats. Strike threats are really important in aviation, Marian, more so than in other industries, because it hits forward bookings. If you announce a strike on a certain date, and you can actually, different unions have used that to punish airlines in the past.
Diarmaid, you were looking at a Business Post caveman.
Well, I mean, the U-turn on union recognition, if that is what it is extraordinary, particularly when you consider that OLeary has specialised in a very coarse, hectoring, hate-filled rhetoric about trade unions and indeed about the public sector.
Men with beards was one of them, I remember.
And I mean, he also, of course, has said that there is no principle that cannot be overturned for competitive reasons. That's another one of Michael O'Leary's soundbites, which seems to be very relevant at the moment. Now, when you consider the business model, and they talk about the success of the business model, it's got a stock market value of 20 billion, so they'll point to all of those.
Dropped 8%
yeah, well, of course,
since this was announced.
And there was reference there to O'Leary's cuteness, but is that starting to run out? Because if you consider what they widely trumpet as the brilliant business model and the business success, what about the other core issue in relation to Ryanair? Can you get loyalty from the people who are working for you? Can Michael O'Leary do that?
Well, whether he did or he didn't, he created an amazing airline.
But I mean, nobody disputes that.
Yeah.
But isn't it interesting the year that Ryanair has had, And when you consider that Michael O'Leary was considered someone for a long time who couldn't put a foot wrong, he's been putting a lot of feet wrong in various places. And you have to wonder, could this be the beginning of a new phase for Ryanair that won't actually involve Michael O'Leary? Because he has, made hints in the not so distant
highly
past.
Unlikely.
Yeah, but I mean, clearly there is a shift in the balance of power. So that is going to affect the way Michael O'Leary does his job.
Michael McDowell?
Well, I mean, I'm amused by all of this. There's brinkmanship being played here. It is very cruel on the travelling public.
Very cruel.
But I presume it'll be resolved one way. I mean, the thing that Diarmaid refers to earlier, the shortage of pilots towards this end of the year, that seems to have evaporated. I don't know how it did evaporate, but the problem seemed to have gone away. But earlier this year, Michael O'Leary was saying that he was suddenly going to become passenger friendly and that they weren't going to have this kind of negative attitude. And the old jokes, in the event of a sudden loss of cabin pressure, insert €2 and the oxygen mask will come down, they're gone. And on the subject of jokes, I noticed that it is strange that an airline pilots union would call itself Impact, This is a shocker. But
I never thought that. True.
But in any event, I do think that Ryanair has been a hugely transformative industry for Ireland, and it has transformed European aviation. It has gone through this macho kind of in-your-face phase, and I think that it's moving now to being a kind of a dominant force in Europe, and it's going to become more civilized, like the Kevin teenager thing. It's going to become a civilized 21 or 22-year-old or whatever. And I really do believe that Michael O'Leary is shrewd man. He's not going to walk away, flounce out in a temper, and his shareholders want him to stay there. But I think that he himself is beginning to realise that having a good image, coming to realistic agreements with your pilots, coming to realistic agreements with your cabin staff, stopping threatening them, that if they don't sell tickets and perfume to people that they'll deduct pay or whatever. This is all crazy stuff. I mean, people like flying Aer Lingus because there's none of that.
Shona?
Yeah, I think that's true actually, but although I would say that the Ryanair has improved in terms of customer friendly, I would have avoided them at all costs before because they were so inflexible and there was a stress associated with actually taking a Ryanair flight. But I think that given the chaos during the summer when lots of people's travels plans were obstructed because of the to do with holiday, you'd think that at this point they would try to do everything to assure that people could have certainty in their plans, particularly around Christmas time. And the idea that you'd say that a union member isn't out of bed yet, but yet the unions are the ones offering to work weekends and engage in a proper plan and agreement to avoid a strike.
The Ryanair are having a duvet day.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's Tuesday night. So if you were thinking that you had to fly somewhere, you still don't know if the strike is going to be called off by Wednesday.
Awful. Yeah, no, it is awful. I will leave the last word to you, Olivia.
Yeah, I suppose standing back from it, it's about a sustainable business model must have authentic and genuine and respectful relationships, whether it's with your employees or any kind of stakeholders. And this is probably the lesson out of that. And Michael talked about the machoism, that perhaps it's not just about the pay deal, but it's about the respect and the language around it. And I just read something during the week from the man who founded Unilever, who was renowned for the treatment of his employees, said even if it's only self-interest enlightenment, that one should mind all the different people you deal with. I think, like Michael has said, huge transformative. When the chapters of Irish economic history are written, I think he has transformed travel, and we all would like to see actually this work. Nobody wants to see dysfunctionality in the Ryanair business model.
Because Aer Lingus and British Airways were running a cartel at one stage. They denied it, and it left these islanders here grounded.
The London-Dublin route was the most expensive and the most protected. And I mean, I go back to at one stage, Ted Nealon brought into the Dáil a bill to make it a criminal offence with massive fines and prison sentences to undersell Aer Lingus. Do you remember when Jan Kaminski was selling bucket rate flights? Things have changed dramatically in the last 30 years.
But the state also assisted Ryanair and Michael O'Leary when it came to the predatory pricing of Aer Lingus. There was state intervention there, and of course
In what way?
He can be very, in terms of demarcation, that they would allow Ryanair to move into that space. Now, of course, O'Leary conveniently leaves that out when he's bashing the public sector generally and bashing the state.
But at one stage, I remember every time they were going to go open another route, Aer Lingus went straight onto that route. I mean, Aer Lingus fought blooming hard to do them down.
But Ryanair also had the support of Haughey at one stage, and when it came to some of the provincial routes, they were given breaks, and Air Rienta was also important for them in terms of writing off certain debts. So, when you dig into the history of Ryanair, there has been more intervention there than perhaps O'Leary would acknowledge. Because he's got such an aggressive privatisation agenda, he's not going to acknowledge that role.
Sorry, yes, Owen?
The big intervention that Diarmaid is referring to is Seamus Brennan, when it actually threatened the future of Ryanair, and he cleared Aer Lingus off the Stansted route. In other words, he gave them a clear run at one of the London airports. It probably saved Ryanair at the time. And Diarmaid is right at saying, Michael O'Leary always talks about state intervention in the big flag carriers that he's fighting across Europe. But that is the one. But it's also true what you said. Life was made very difficult for them, and they came very near closure in their early years. The one conversation I did have with Michael O'Leary some time before this happened, I asked him about the airline in which his entire business model was based in America, which has no problem dealing with unions. And he said, well, that's because they've got old and fat and middle-aged. And maybe that's what's going on here behind the scenes. It could be applied to our own good airline chief executive.
Maybe O'Leary himself needs to go like that.
Right. We leave it there for the moment. Listen, Owen, thank you very much indeed for taking that call, because obviously you weren't using... Oh, no, because it's all still flying, because he's out of the country at the moment. Now,